Welcome once again to your program, Perspectivas. Greetings, my name is Gabby Perozzo. Today we welcome David Goldwyn to our program. David is the chair of the advisory group on energy matters at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. He is also chairman of Goldwyn Global Strategies, an international consulting firm in this area, and it was also in special envoy of international energy during the Barack Obama presidency, and it was Subsecretary of Energy for International Relations for President Bill Clinton. Thank you very much for being here.
Good to be here.
What is your overall assessment of the current state of the energy sector in Venezuela? As the licenses are set to fully expire, which key areas should we pay special attention to?
Well, Venezuela's energy sector today has been on a bit of a path to recovery from the days of maximum pressure. So under the Chevron licenses, which have a fiscal regime, a monetary regime where 30% of the money from oil sales goes to reinvestment, 20% goes to debt repayment, and 50% goes in tax and royalty and bolivars to the government, production has been able to recover. And exports have diversified from going pretty much only to China at very significant discounts to going to the United States and to China and until very recently to India as well. So production had been recovering, exports had been recovering, and I think refining of products for domestic consumption had been refining. So I think that was all a positive. The presence of the Russians and the Iranians in the sector had diminished under the license regime. Under maximum pressure, Iran had been the only source of diluent to be able to turn the very heavy crude into a refinable product. But we're really at the point now of a very significant change. So I can talk about that, in a second. Sort of once the Chevron license winds down on May 25th, if that doesn't change, and if secondary tariffs go into place, which will punish any importer of Venezuelan crude with a 25% tariff. If that takes place, then the Venezuelan energy sector is poised for the kind of decline that we saw under maximum pressure.
Yeah, we would like your evaluation on this move, like secondary tariff and the totally stop of their license with Chevron and the European companies.
Gotcha. So here's what's proposed. I mean, what the Trump administration wants to do is wind down all the licenses for Chevron and for other companies in Venezuela. That means Chevron will have to leave the country, will not be able to invest. It means that no foreign company can import crude from Venezuela unless they're willing to risk a 25% tariff. And none of the Western companies, Morrell and Prom and Repsol and Chevron, that operate there would really be allowed to operate without risking a penalty from the U.S. So if that happens, we're likely to see a few consequences. This is essentially a return to the maximum pressure campaign of the first Trump administration, with the additional penalty of secondary tariffs, this 25% tariff, by means of stricter enforcement. So what we saw under maximum pressure one, if I can call it that, under the Trump administration, was a precipitous decline in Venezuelan production. I think it went from around 1.2 million barrels a day down to about 450,000 barrels a day. You saw obviously the significant decrease in revenue. You saw Iran be the primary supplier of diluent, and you saw enormous financial distress inside Venezuela. I think it was the largest financial collapse, according to Francisco Rodriguez at the University of Denver, that we'd seen, really even worse than the U.S. Depression. And that, of course, led to the migration of almost 7.7 million Venezuelans to Colombia and to neighboring countries, and quite a number to the U.S. as well, largely driven by economics. So if all these new policies go into place, I think we're likely to see a return to that. First, we will see all of Venezuela's crude go to China, because China now is already at over 100% tariffs from the United States for other reasons. The Chinese have said basically we don't care what you do anymore in terms of, what's another 25%. They haven't said that with respect to Venezuelan oil, but essentially they've already have maximal tariffs from the United States anyway. So I think you're likely to see Venezuelan crude go to China, but at sort of the 25 to 40% discount that you saw under maximum pressure one, which means Venezuela will export oil and get a lot less money for it. 100% of that money will go to the Venezuelan government as opposed to 50%, which goes right now under the license regime. And there'll be no transparency. Right now, OFAC publishes, the U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Control, the U.S. Treasury Department publishes essentially what's exported to the U.S. and what money is earned from that. There'll be no transparency, and the Venezuelan government will get all of those proceeds. And you're likely to see a very steady decline in production because reinvestment will stop, foreign management will stop, and the ability of PDVSA to actually run these projects without help. They can do it on a minimal basis, on a skeleton basis, but we saw before was a significant decline. And then you have the risk also of reentry of foreign powers. So it's possible, if the Maduro regime does not believe that these sanctions are temporary or a tool of negotiation, that they will invite other players to come in. They haven't done that before, but they could invite the Russians, they could invite Turkey, they could invite other countries to come in and take over these projects. You'll see a return of Iran's influence in Venezuela because they will be the only source of diluent. And as before, the Russians, who never left Venezuela, may step in essentially as traders to buy that oil and resell it to others. So I think we're likely to see a return to the economic distress and therefore the migration pressure and the return of U.S. adversaries and foreign powers to Venezuela, just as we saw in maximum pressure one.
Yeah, so for you, is a maximum pressure as the same as the previous, or maybe he will use new instruments and a new approach on this? Like, do you see the same strategy right now?
Well, it's maximum pressure plus. I think the new tool that they're talking about are these secondary tariffs. And so you've already seen India essentially swear off imports of Venezuelan crude in anticipation of these tariffs. So it's ironic. The real beneficiary of this Venezuela policy is Russia, because Russian crude, heavy crude, can still be purchased. So essentially, the decline in Venezuelan exports to places like India will be replaced by imports of Russian crude. So I think it's maximum pressure plus is really the policy. What we haven't seen really is what's the strategy. So back in January, Richard Grenell, a special envoy for special missions for the Trump administration, said diplomacy is back and seemed to be negotiating for a return of migrants to Venezuela, release of hostages, and the promise, I think, of negotiation for some democratization or positive developments in terms of the political space inside Venezuela. But then he ran afoul of U.S. domestic politics, and to give a sort of a sidetrack, I can explain this for your audience. Essentially, the President Trump is trying to get a major tax cut. He has to pass that through the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives. The Republicans had, at that point, a 5-vote plurality in the House, and so they really can't afford to lose a vote. And when it came time to vote for a budget instruction, which was key for this tax policy, 3 Cuban-American Florida members of Congress essentially communicated, it's reported, to the administration that they would not support this budget instruction. They would put the president's tax cut at risk unless he returned to maximum pressure. So Grenell was out, maximum pressure was back, and Marco Rubio and Mauricio Claveron, the special envoy for Latin America, essentially won the day with the support of these Florida Congress members of Congress. Maximum pressure was out. But what we haven't seen, frankly, from Grenell, and what we haven't seen from Secretary Rubio, is what's the strategy? What are they asking for? Are they asking for open elections, no intimidation of the opposition, constitutional reform, holding of elections? what are they asking for that has a reasonable chance of success? The former policy, essentially of regime change, where the administration is saying Maduro and everyone else must leave or sanctions won't be lifted, resulted in a lot of pain for Venezuelans and basically no political change. The only political change we actually did see was when licenses were exchanged for a political process, and then you had the election in July, which Edmundo Rodriguez won, and you had the Venezuelan population see and the world see just how little support the Maduro regime had, and how popular the opposition was, which won the election. So you had an enormous political victory, even though the election was stolen, but an enormous transformation in the political perception of the Maduro regime in and outside of Venezuela, because there was a strategy to exchange sanctions relief for something material and significant in the political space. That's what we're not seeing right now. What's the Venezuela strategy? What are they negotiating for? What's the ask? Is it tariffs forever, or is there sanctions relief in exchange for something? And we haven't seen this, nor have we frankly seen a return of Special Envoy Grenell or anyone else to Venezuela to negotiate this. So that's kind of what we're waiting to see. Is it just really, Venezuela being used as a political pawn in U.S. budget negotiations, or is there a real strategy? So long answer to your question, but I think what we're seeing with Maximum Pressure Plus is pain for the energy sector, pain for Venezuelans, probably more migration pressure, but we're not really seeing the political strategy yet, and maybe that's still to come.
Yeah, and if you were designing the sanctions, managing the sanction policy for Venezuela, what will be your proposal, not only in the executive branch, but in the bipartisan? What is your recommendation on this?
Okay, I think it's a really important question, and it's a complex question. I mean, I think the history has been that causing economic pain to a domestic population rarely produces a change in the regime. So you don't get political change in a country, whether it's Iran or Russia or China, by punishing the citizens. There's an expression in English that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so sanctions are what everybody knows to use as a tool. But essentially, when you look, you have to ask the question as a policymaker: are sanctions an effective tool in producing political change in Venezuela? And what are the other consequences of using that tool? And we've seen this movie before. We've seen this in Maximum Pressure One. And the answer is, if you just cause enormous economic pain, then you punish the citizens, they leave, foreign powers come in, and you don't produce political change. So I would say that it would be the policy that I would suggest is, first, understand what your strategy is. Do no harm. You don't want to punish more people than you benefit. So in this case, it's you don't want to punish the Venezuelan people unless you're getting political change out of Maduro. And this is why polling by data analysis show that sanctions are largely unpopular in Venezuela. Second, from a U.S. point of view, selfishly, you don't want to implement a policy which is adverse to U.S. interests, which causes more migration, which increases Chinese influence, which increases Iranian influence. And third, you want a policy that involves Venezuela's neighbors and other allies, because they are more strongly affected by migration policy. So you want the Colombians, the Brazilians, Spain, a lot of the frontline states in a policy that's coordinated. And I think so. I would return to the license regime, which essentially reduces the power of Venezuela's government over the economy. We've learned in political science is that if you put all of the power of economics into the government's hands, if they distribute diesel, if they distribute fuel, if they distribute food, everyone is beholden to the power of the government. So what you want to do is you want to privatize the economy as much as possible and reduce the power of the government. So I would say the old license regime did that by essentially putting private companies in charge of the energy sector and giving only bolivars and tax and royalty and 50 cents on the dollar to to the government. But also having citizens back in the country creates more of an ability to create political change from the bottom up. I mean, we've learned from the U.S. hugely unsuccessful Cuba policy over the last 35 years is if you take all of the activists and the people with economic and political power out of the country and you move them to Miami, who's left inside to affect political change? So you essentially disempowered, the citizenry by taking, your most, effective actors and having them leave that, take their capital and leave the country. So I would say, you want a strategy which takes power out of the hands of the government and puts it in the hands of the private sector to foment change from the bottom up. And then you want sanctions which target both the members of the regime and their enablers. So you want, and this is where it comes, having allies helps. You don't want Maduro, or anybody else to be able to travel anywhere. You don't want to be able to have them send their kids to school. They shouldn't be able to go to Spain and go shopping. They shouldn't be able to, they should be basically trapped in Venezuela. Them, the military, their enablers, all of their supporters, with individual sanctions joined by other countries. So they get to live in the mess that they're creating. And they don't get to both profit and to enjoy themselves by going elsewhere. So, I think that's targeting those sanctions at the right people and at their bank accounts and at their assets overseas. And I think it's also reducing the ability of the incumbent regime to have status. He shouldn't be seen by heads of state anywhere. He should be relegated to an assistant secretary to essentially diminish their credibility and image in the world. Is that sufficient to cause political change? No, this is really it's more about strategy and creating pressure. But political change in any country and political change in Venezuela is going to come from Venezuelans. It's going to come from, basically internally creating the conditions, creating the pressure so that not just the regime, but the members of the military and everybody else realizes there's a better way. It also means you need an exit strategy for the regime. And this is really, incumbent on the opposition and others. You have so many elements of the Maduro regime which either have jobs now in parts of the economy or fear that they'll basically be jailed or worse if there's any kind of change in power. So you need to have a more public strategy which says, they can be exiled to another country. They can get immunity if they give up power, or there will be a transition, maybe constitutional change. So you've got to create an off-ramp for the existing regime, not so much so that, Maduro and the leaders of the PSUV will decide, oh, that sounds like a good off-ramp, I'm going to go. But so that when you have pressure for change, and maybe this comes from the military, maybe it comes from the sectors of the economy, you can paint a picture which says life with political change will not mean death for everybody in the existing regime, and that there's an economic future for all of the people who are entrenched in the current economy. You look at South Africa's transition and and in other places, and it's not so much about power sharing, but it's about what is the status of people afterwards, and that has to be part of it also. But essentially, it's coming from within. There's no foreign military coming to push him out, and there's no amount of economic pain that will work because we've learned is authoritarian regimes will fight the last citizen. They're not the ones who are suffering, but they are willing to accept an unlimited amount of pain for the people who live in the country because they have food and they have money and they have security and they're willing to sacrifice everybody else to hold power. So external pressure is punishing, in a sense, the wrong people. So I'd restore the license regime, and I would have a much more targeted sanction regime and a multilateral strategy and an exit strategy. I think those are the core elements.
Yeah, recently PDVSA abruptly canceled export authorization for several Chevron vessels due to the payment, the sanction, and everything related to that. Do you think this is not getting to the goal that is pressure Maduro regime because they are taking the decisions, not United States. They are weakening U.S. leverage?
Well, I don't know if it weakens U.S. leverage, but it's really, what it means is it is a signal which the U.S. administration should understand that just because you don't allow Chevron to export doesn't mean Venezuela is not going to export oil. It will do what it did before. It will use shadow traders and hidden vessels, and it will continue to export all of the oil that it has. It will go to China directly or indirectly, but now it's going to go at a 30 or 40% discount. For the regime, does that make a difference? They were only getting 50 cents on the dollar, under the license regime. So, but they were getting it in bolivars. Now maybe it'll be barter, maybe it'll be renminbi, maybe it'll be dollars, but they'll get 100% of whatever the take is, and they'll ship it elsewhere. So I think it is a sign to the administration that the strategy is not going to be effective. But frankly, the Trump administration, before we had our congressional politics intervene, they knew maximum pressure didn't work. Grinnell was not going for maximum pressure. That was not the strategy. I think they all understood that what they did before was an enormous failure, both for Venezuelans, because it punished them and it didn't change the regime, but it was an enormous disaster for US policy because it helped our adversaries and it increased migration. So they knew this, but domestic politics won out. But I think by Maduro, canceling these export licenses, he's saying, we know what to do. We'll be fine. We'll just go back to what we were doing before. So, it is a little bit of a flex, as they say, by Maduro, but it should be read by the Trump administration of an indication of just how unsuccessful their policy is likely to be. And I would say, there is some hope that as our congressional politics resolve and we figure out our budget politics, that the policy may be revisited because the Trump administration does understand. I think enough people, if not President Trump himself, enough people understand that this policy does not serve U.S. interests as well as not serving Venezuela's interests. So once they no longer need those 3 votes, from the Keep It American delegation, who knows? We'll see where the world economy is and see where migration is. But if adverse consequences have resumed, and people think it's not a great idea to be subsidizing the Chinese economy, then maybe they'll take another look and revise the policy.
Yeah, you mentioned Russia and Iran, but it's kind of different, the situation they had in 2020 and now with the wars and the pressure specifically against Iran by the Trump administration. Do you think they really have the power, the money, the motivation to come back entirely to the Venezuelan energy sector, or maybe it's more China, the one who can take advantage of this?
Well, Iran's role previously was only to swap diluent for crude. So Iran produces a lot of those products. They were a decent supplier of that. And so it was basically a very efficient trade for Iran. Do they have the ability to resume that trade? I think they have not yet suffered from maximum pressure from the U.S. This is threatened, but there has not been significantly increased enforcement. There could be a deal in which case there will be fewer restrictions on Iran, and exports will increase, and that trade will be much easier. It would, in fact, potentially be legitimate. Or a 25% tariff on Iranian exports to the U.S. is meaningless to Iran. We don't import anything from Iran. So I think the Iranians could do that, perhaps not quickly. They have other trading relationships. So I think they could come back. But if they don't come back in a significant way, that's just less production and more economic pain for Venezuela. With respect to China, even though Chinese domestic oil production has increased and they have a choice of crudes, the larger the discount, the better a deal it is for China. They're still an enormous importer. Venezuelan exports to China never went away. They just decreased by about 25%, basically replaced by Venezuelan exports through Chevron to the United States. So if the U.S. trade goes away, China will continue to take that oil. They'll just do it at a greater discount. So it's a bargain for China. So I think in terms of their demand, their economic power, they'll be able to do it. And I think the threats of the Trump administration at this point are diminishing in efficacy because they've piled on so many different tariffs on the Chinese economy. The Chinese, pretty much signal they don't care anymore.
Yeah,
So
and
I think it'll continue.
do you think China doesn't care about the secondary tariff? They stopped for a while some operation in Venezuela, but they will be concerned about that, or the tariff if go like bigger and bigger, so they don't care. They will go to Venezuela without taking care of this secondary tariff.
Yes, I think at this point the Chinese don't care about the secondary tariffs. I think the Trump administration has piled on so many different tariffs on top of the Chinese economy. I think even not counting Venezuela, it's already at sort of like 125%. So, maybe there's a U.S.-China trade deal. I don't think so. I think the administration wants a restructuring of the global economy. I don't think they want to deal with China. So now the tariffs are so high. I mean, I think the Chinese are looking at redirecting trade. So I think they won't care, and particularly they call them the so-called smaller or teapot refineries in China that tend to access this Venezuelan crude. Don't sell anything in the United States anyway, so they're not worried about individual sanctions. So I don't think the Chinese care anymore.
Yeah, it's been argued that the sanctions will bring more migrants to the United States. However, the Trump administration message make it clear to these migrants that coming to the United States is not an option anymore. My concern is the other countries, Colombia, Brazil. Are they being considered within this strategy, like having more pressure, more migrants all over the continent, but not United States anymore, will be a problem for those countries, right?
Yeah, it does not appear that the Trump administration is consulting deeply with those countries or considering the impact on them. Um, I think we have seen, that the correlation between economic deprivation and migration is well established. Again, this Francisco Rodriguez study from University of Denver's has documented that pretty effectively. And so it is likely to cause more pain. And yes, the Trump administration's made clear not only by border enforcement, but by unsuccessfully attempting to end temporary protected status for Venezuelans already in the United States, that they are really not concerned about the fate of Venezuelans. They may be able to keep them out of the United States, but that frankly remains to be seen how effective that strategy is. But I think the neighbors are in for some rough treatment, and there's no indication that they're being either strongly consulted or listened to when it comes to this policy.
For you, what would it be the biggest mistake the United States cannot afford to repeat in this energy strategy to Venezuela? Like we are coming back to the past, and what could it bring to the Venezuelan and the entire hemisphere?
The abandonment of the existing license regime and the return to maximum pressure, I think, is just an enormous mistake. I think it will severely harm U.S. interests by subsidizing the Chinese economy and potentially increasing the power of Iran and putting money and power and control back into the hands of the Venezuelan government. I think it will not be effective, not only will not be effective in dislodging the regime, I think it will have much more likely, it will strongly empower the regime by putting the control of the energy sector more firmly back in the hands of the government. So I think from U.S. and U.S. interest point of view, it'll be a disaster. And I think in terms of Venezuelans, I think it will not produce the intended result, which is to cause political change. And it will punish Venezuela's citizens. It will punish Venezuela's neighbors. So, and it may, in fact, lead to more migration in the United States. It remains to be seen, as we've discussed, how effective the border strategy is. So I think this return to maximum pressure is a highly predictable mistake, which will have exactly the same results it had the last time, potentially worse. So I think that's the biggest mistake. That's the thing I worry about the most. And I think we are already seeing the impacts of this policy before May 25th, before it's even taken place, as we're seeing, trade redirected to China at these discounts. So, it's too early to tell whether there'll be migration results, but you combine that with the global decrease in the price of oil, and the amount of national revenue available for diesel, for electricity and agriculture and hospitals and transportation was already going to decrease. So, yeah, I think it's that in the absence of a political strategy for change is a huge mistake. And frankly, the other things which the U.S. did to try and strengthen civil societies overseas and to empower, alternative communications and to strengthen the ability of opposition parties, the Trump administration has abandoned that by destroying the U.S. Agency for International Development and the U.S. Institute for Peace and every institution that we had, which helped opposition parties, like in Venezuela's, to be able to strategize to affect, political change. So, yeah, I think it's quite a series of mistakes which will have, predictably negative results. And
Yeah,
it's
do
so
you
avoidable.
see the American companies leaving the country entirely, leaving this area empty that was previously controlled by the United States, like as a part of those mistakes?
They will have no choice. I mean, essentially, if they, under the first general licenses from the Trump administration, they were allowed to remain in country and essentially to sustain operations. But they can only do what these licenses permit. And so, they will have to leave. And unless they are permitted legally to do otherwise, and there's no indication yet that those licenses will change. The policy could change in the future, and they could be allowed to re-enter, and it will take time if they are allowed to re-enter to go back and rebuild and to restore what was damaged, as we saw the last time. But they'll have to do that, and other countries are really not willing to risk either the tariffs or risk getting crossways with the United States, where they have other investments and other trade, in order to protect their Venezuelan assets. So at some point, if this continues too long, they will leave and not come back, and you will see them replaced. But I am hopeful, I think, that once we see the consequences of this policy and we get past our domestic politics, that the administration will be able to take, another look at its strategy in Venezuela and perhaps consider other options.
Yeah. As your conclusion, what do you think about other actors, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, or maybe European countries having like a different approach about sanctions, not sectoral, but personal sanctions, or other kind of tools to make Maduro accountable for the crimes, because that's another thing. You don't have enough things to pressure him.
I think it's time. I mean, I think for as long as the U.S. administration is going to leave the field, essentially, when it comes to diplomatic strategy, and just have this one policy of isolation, I think it's time for the neighbors to step up and for Spain and to come up with a coordinated strategy, to put pressure on the regime to have their own sanctions on the regime when it comes to individuals, but also to look at a diplomatic strategy which helps create a political transition inside Venezuela and signals an off-ramp for the regime should it choose to leave. That essentially one of those, Spain could say, if you do this, you would be welcome to serve your exile in Spain, immune from prosecution. So I think it's time to do that, and we're seeing this all around the world. That as the U.S. takes a more adversarial stance with its neighbors, with Canada and with Europe and with others, and aligns itself with autocracies, you're seeing other countries form new alignments. And so, I think there is really room for leadership from Brazil and Colombia. Maybe Brazil, because Colombia's had a bit more of an adversarial relationship with the regime, and some former presidents have threatened, or asked for a military intervention. So, maybe more challenging for the Colombians to lead, but certainly to be part of the coalition. But I think it's time for them to step up, and work with the opposition for what's an effective way forward. I think there's a real vacuum there, and I think it would be effective for the neighbors to fill it. And frankly, it would give the U.S. an option a couple of months from now as to whether it wishes to align itself with the hemisphere's policy rather than the other way around.
Thank you so much.
My great pleasure.
Really appreciate. So you are president of the energetic, I have it
I'm president of Goldwyn Global Strategies. That's my consulting firm. And
Yes.
I am chairman of the Atlantic Council's Energy Advisory Group.
Energy advice. Okay. Yes. And I can also say that you were like a special envoy for energy, international energy, with Barack Obama, and subsecretary of energy in international relation with Bill Clinton, right?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. So I will let you know. This is going out on Thursday, 8 a.m. I'll be preparing all the translation, and I will send you the link. Okay.
The link. Oh, great. Terrific.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. Best of luck. It's an enormously complicated
I know.
issue.
Yeah, no, it's
And
hard.
I'm very sympathetic to the people who say maximum pressure, put all the sanctions on, force them out. It didn't work here, and it hasn't worked historically in other countries.
Yeah, no, the world is now different, so they need to understand that. But it's hard because sometimes you just need to punish them.
Yeah, you want to do something.
So, yeah.
Those were the remarks of David Goldwyn, who serves as the chair of the advisory group at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. He additionally has collaborated in these matters with the administrations of Barack Obama and Bill Clinton,